Critiques, often called Ks, are an off-case position that use philosophical ideas to formulate ethical objections to the affirmative. They criticize the desirability of the 1AC. These criticisms are focused on the assumptions of the 1AC instead of just the plan text or the effects of the plan. Ks are often concerned with adding certain historical or structural context to the F and generally criticize the values of the 1AC. Let's set up two examples to use throughout the video. An AF that stops selling F-16s to Taiwan versus the security critique, and an AF that increases the number of EB-3 and EB-5 visas the US government gives out against a capitalism critique. Let's assume that this version of our Taiwan AF has two advantages: China war and climate change. The security critique says that the affirmative securitizes against China, meaning they attribute malignant intentions to them. This securitization creates a self-fulfilling prophecy wherein China is forced to be more aggressive to deal with US influence in East Asia. This securitization inevitably causes the impacts the AF was trying to avoid. Instead, we should stop securitizing against China. This version of our high-skilled immigration AF has two advantages: econ and nanotech. The capitalism critique says that the AF's investment in neoliberalism props up these fundamentally unsustainable systems. Because capitalism is premised on endless growth, eventually we will either run out of resources or come into conflict with other countries over this growth, causing the impacts the AF was trying to avoid. Instead, we should embrace the Communist Party and work to take down capitalism as a structure. Just like with other off-case positions, critiques are generally all structured the same way. Critiques have three main parts: link, impact, and alternative. The link tells us what the K has to do with the AF. It tells us exactly what assumptions or values in the 1AC the K is criticizing. The link is often pretty generic in the 1AC. It can apply to any AF on the topic because it's more about the assumptions the resolution has made than the actual AF itself. Now, these assumptions should hypothetically be the same, at least if the AF is topical. Links are often grounded in the clashing worldviews between the K and the AF. AFs tend to view the maintenance of the global liberal order and civil society as a good thing. Critiques aren't always so sure. The security K criticizes the assumptions about international relations present in the Taiwan AF. The 1AC assumes that the US ought to be the arbiter of who does and does not have access to what weapons. The K also says that the AF's removal of weapons is rooted in a desire to maintain US influence in the region. It's more about controlling China's behavior than anything else. The Cap K criticizes the assumptions about economics present in the high-skilled workers AF. The AF is only interested in immigrants because they can be exploited for economic gain. This immigration AF specifically also directly says that maintaining the current US economic system is a good thing via their economy advantage. The impact of the critique is the bad thing that comes from the assumptions the 1AC has made. K impacts tend to be broad forms of structural violence. They are generally concerned with what is ethical. They couple arguments about ethics with some way to get an in to the AF's impacts. The impact of the security K is generally endless war with two different components: threat construction and self-fulfilling prophecy. The US security apparatus is designed to maintain US hegemony on a global scale. So in order to justify this paradigm to the average citizen, the US constructs a threat. This creates a paradox for the US. It needs there to constantly be some sort of threat, but this shining city on a hill narrative starts to fall apart if it never actually manages to beat any of the threats. So, what's a hegemon to do? Just construct a different threat. This continues endlessly, thus the name Endless War. Unfortunately, all this threat construction can end up creating some actual threats. This is where the self-fulfilling prophecy portion comes in. Because we've spent so long threatening China as though they were a rival, they become one in order to protect themselves. There's something similar to be said about the War on Terror. Europe has been meddling in and colonizing the Middle East for a very, very long time. But things got really spicy after World War II when the Soviet Union and the West started fighting for influence in the Middle East. Turning the Middle East into a literal battleground didn't exactly ingratiate the United States to Middle Eastern countries. This is what created a lot of the anti-American sentiment we see in the Middle East today, thus the circumstances for the ensuing War on Terror. This type of analysis can then be applied to the AF's impacts to explain how doing the AF creates the impacts that they were attempting to avoid. The impact to the Cap K is a little more variable, but generally includes environmental destruction and endless war. Capitalism as an economic system creates a massive incentive for excessive resource extraction. Anti-capitalists would say that this excessive resource extraction has caused our current climate change predicament, and that the incentive for growth at all costs means the ruling class is unwilling to stop or slow carbon emissions because it would cost them money. The drive for resources also causes conflict. The US is incentivized to invade other countries to get access to oil or other resources, creating a cycle of endless wars over those resources. The Cap K then says that in either scenario, extinction becomes inevitable, which means it's try or die for the alt. Try or die arguments are common for all types of advocacies in debate. AFs, counterplans, and alts can all rely on try or die arguments. Try or die as a framing argument just says that extinction is inevitable if the judge votes for the other team, so even if the judge isn't 100% sure that the solution you've offered will work, it's the only chance we've got. The alternative is the part of the K that tells us what to do about this problem. As you may have noticed, the impacts that critiques talk about are not unique to the F. This is why you might hear people say critiques are just not unique to sets. This isn't really true for a lot of reasons, but the most obvious of which is that Ks have an alternative that creates uniqueness for the impacts. The two popular alts for security are rejection and cosmopolitanism. Rejection alts simply say that because the F is unethical, the judge should reject it. The security K layers this ethical imperative on top of arguments about self-fulfilling prophecies and serial policy failure. We'll talk more about serial policy failure in a bit. Making these arguments in conjunction with one another makes the rejection alt a little more strategic because it presents an offensive reason not to do the F both in an ethical sense and in a utilitarian sense. Remember that distinction for when we get to talking about framework in the 2AC. Cosmopolitanism is an alternate worldview that basically wants there to be one global community. This can be a little bit more difficult to defend because Burke is sort of sketchy on the logistics. Alts for the cap K usually boil down to historical materialism, but they can vary from just analysis through a materialist lens to join the revolution. One of the benefits Marxists find in historical materialism is that it can demystify certain historical events. The most common example here is the American Revolution. In the popular American imaginary, the American Revolution was fought for freedom and ideas about the inherent dignity of all land-owning white men. A Marxist, however, would say that the American Revolution was fought so the emerging merchant class in the US could escape from the power of the monarchy and begin to accumulate wealth. This type of demystification can be beneficial all on its own. It can help us escape some of the social conditioning capitalism puts us through. But the alt can also go a step further and say that in order to escape the impacts of capitalism once and for all, we've got to start the revolution. Now that we've established what a K, 1, and C includes, let's go over how the 2AC answers the K. Like with any other type of off-case position, giving a 2AC against a K requires predicting how the argument is going to evolve in the block, and setting up arguments in the 2AC so that the 1AR can apply them later. This means that giving a 2AC versus a K can be confusing for the first few times around because you're answering arguments that haven't been made yet. Preempting these arguments, however, is crucial to dealing with the time disparity between the block and the 1AR. When you're preparing your 2AC, you also want to figure out what the ideal 2AR strat is. There are two primary options when answering the K, an extinction outweighs strat and a perm strat. The 2AC on a K generally needs to start with framework. This may not be true if you're reading a KAF, but if your AF uses fiat, you need a framework argument. Framework is a type of theory argument. It's a debate about debate. Just like all other theory arguments, your framework argument needs to have an interpretation, standards, and voters. On the AF, your framework interp needs to be some version of we get to weigh the AF. The wording that people usually go with is the role of the ballot is to weigh the plan versus a competitive alternative. Let's break that down a little bit. The role of the ballot argument tells the judge what the function in voting for either team serves. In this instance, the ballot just says which is better, the AF or the competitive alternative. The competitive alternative portion of this is to stipulate that the judge should be voting for something, not against something. In an AF v disad debate, the judge can vote for the AF or for the status quo. In an AF v counterplan debate, the judge can vote for the AF or for the counterplan. In an AF v K debate, that means the judge can vote for the AF or the alt. This does two things. The AF gets to have an AF, and the neg doesn't get to just win without defending something. One argument that can be made in the 2 and C on any K is that the epistemology of the AF is flawed, and fiat is illusory, so we shouldn't concern ourselves with the consequences of the plan. We'll explain more about this when we get to the block, but basically it's common for the block to make an argument that the AF doesn't have an AF anymore. This framework interp is designed to stipulate that the AF does in fact have an AF, and the neg doesn't just get to magically make the 1AC disappear. This framework interp also says that the judge should not vote for the negative unless they can prove the alternative solves. That might sound basic, but there are some Ks that sometimes kick the alternative in the 2 and R. The standards the AF reads on framework are determined by the impacts that they think their interp solves, aka the voters. Just like with all other theory arguments in debate, we basically have two impacts: fairness and education. There are folks that would add other impacts or say fairness is not an impact, but these are the two most common things people use as impacts in theory debates. So that's the way we're going to talk about it. Both of these are exactly what they sound like. Is the debate educational, and is the debate fair? Generally, in a policy VK debate, the AF is more likely to win arguments about fairness than education, since getting to magic away the 1AC is pretty unfair. The standards then act as internal links to our impacts. Some of the most common ones are predictability, clash and ground, real-world education, topic education, critical thinking, and decision-making, just to name a few. Since the AF is most likely concerned with fairness, standards about fairness are often used as external impacts to the AF's framework interpretation, while education standards are used to internal link turn the negatives framework inter. There are two primary fairness standards, predictability and clash. Predictability is concerned with one side's ability to predict the argument the other side was going to read. This determines how prepared the first side can be to answer the second side's argument. If one side is prepared and one isn't, guess which side is more likely to win? The argument here is that the neg's framework interp in the block could morph into basically anything. To protect the 1AR, the AF should get to weigh the AF, regardless of other arguments made in the debate. The core of the AF's offense is the 1AC. Sure, you can put offense on other flows, but it's very rare that the AF wins without the AF. An interp that takes away the 1AC makes it nearly impossible for the AF to win. The education umbrella gets a little bit bigger because debate has the potential to teach us about so many different things. Topic education is education about the topic. This means that you need a reason learning about this specific topic is important. Real-world education can refer to a lot of different things, but it often becomes about the benefits of having the reform versus revolution debate. The argument is that activists in the real world need an in-depth knowledge about organizing, government structures, and the legislative process. Why focus on activists? Because we started acknowledging that policy debate doesn't actually trade us for policy. For a while, the prevailing answer was that debate was a training ground for policymakers, so we needed to talk about the details of a plan text. In reality, most policy debaters probably aren't going to be policymakers, but a lot of us do become activists, and all of us end up becoming decision makers in one respect or another. The decision-making standard can thus also be its own separate argument. One of the things debate forces you to do is to make decisions about which arguments are the most important, which is a useful skill set no matter where your life ends up going. But those decisions aren't very difficult if the AF just doesn't get access to their offense. Along with this goes critical thinking skills. Debate requires you to evaluate argument quality, creating useful argument interaction, and predicting your opponent's arguments. That's a lot of critical thinking, unless your opponent's arguments all suck because you magicked away their most important ones. Predictability and clash can also be used on the education debate. Debating against a well-prepared opponent makes the debate all around better. Everyone knows what they're talking about, so the quality of the debate increases substantially. This can also be said of clash. If one side doesn't have anything to say, the other side wins more by default than because they actually debated well. This means neither team learns much information-wise or debate skills-wise. The framework debate is also where AFs typically place their util first cards. Utilitarianism or util is a philosophy that says we should always seek to do the most good for the largest number of people. Hard-right AFs will use this when debating the K to say extinction comes first. If everyone dies, that's probably not the most good for the most amount of people. AFs may also preempt epistemology and ontology arguments here. We'll talk more about what those look like when we get to the block. Now, don't treat this as like the stone tablet for framework debates. Framework is the part of debate that's evolving the fastest since the introduction of planless AFs, so people often innovate new standards or treat some standards as standalone impacts. The next thing the 2AC needs is a permutation or a perm. A perm is a combination that includes all of the AF and all or part of the alt to prove that the two aren't mutually exclusive. Perms are tests of competition, not advocacies. This can be confusing because of the way we word them. Perm, do the AF and join the party sure sounds like a new advocacy, but this is just illustrating that someone could hypothetically both increase the cap for EB3 and EB5 visas and join the Communist Party. The perm is trying to illustrate that there is no opportunity cost to doing both the plan and the alt. At their core, perms are just no-link arguments with some special features. Perms should help shield the link to the K. Basically, this means that even if the neg wins a risk of their link argument, because the alt and the AF aren't inherently mutually exclusive, the judge should just do the AF since both can be done at the same time anyway. Then the 2AC needs to answer the link arguments directly. Here's where you directly say, no, the AF does not securitize against China, or no, the AF isn't capitalist. These are often not the truest arguments in the world, but your goal here is to create as many distinctions as possible between what their evidence talks about and what the 1AC actually did. Their evidence probably gives some examples in the past about when the US did some shady stuff to counter China, but it's probably not actually about stopping the sale of F-16s to Taiwan. Or their evidence may talk about the way immigration debates in the US are centered around immigrants as ways to grow the economy, but they're probably not about the necessity of immigrants to develop nanotech so we can reverse climate change. The goal is to make the judge think that the link is just different enough from the affirmative that the permutation should be preferred. Along with straight-up no-link arguments, the AF should also be making link of omission, links to the status quo, and you do it too arguments whenever possible. A link of omission is when the link is more about what the AF didn't talk about than what they did. These are commonly concerned with a specific group of marginalized people. For example, if we were going to read a feminist international relations critique against the Taiwan AF, one of the link arguments could be about the gender norms that play out in international relations. The US often feminizes China to demean or discredit them, and the 1AC's lack of perspective on this dynamic is a choice to continue the gender practices already present in international relations scholarship. The AF's answer to links of omission should be, the 1AC is only 8 minutes long, so you didn't mention X group creates an impossible burden for the AF to meet. Links are to the status quo arguments say that the neg's link arguments apply to the way things are instead of what the AF actually does, which means the problem isn't unique to the affirmative. To some degree, this is true. Since the AF can't be a thing already, it's pretty hard for the neg to have link cards specific to the action of the plan. This is a little more true for critiques than other off-case positions. Critiques come from the philosophy and critical theory departments instead of from the poli-sci department. If you tried to publish a critical theory paper on a policy that doesn't actually exist, you would not make it very far. Philosophy and critical theory analyze existing phenomena to speak to the human condition or some condition of civil society. Poli-sci scholars, legal scholars, and journalists, which are typically where we get our disad and counterplot arguments from, are more likely to write about proposed policies and what the effects of those policies might be. You do it too just means that the negative also did whatever their link argument is. If, for example, the neg is reading a cap K and a state's counterplan, you should say that the counterplan links to the K. This doesn't mean the neg auto loses or something. It just makes their ethics and epistemology arguments less sincere. This can have a couple of implications. It might mean that the neg just straight up doesn't meet their own framework interpretation, depending on what that interpretation is. So the judge should default AF on framework. It could also mean, depending on how good your argument is, that the neg's performance links to the K. The form of the negative's performance, not just the content of their speeches, re-entrenches the systems they criticize. This usually means the neg read multiple off with a really hardline alternative that typically needs to be part of a one-off K strat. The very performance of the 1 and C in this instance would take off some of the authors whose work they're using. Then the AF should answer the impact when possible. This makes more sense when the K is cap or security or something like that. There's plenty of people willing to defend the security mindset. The security case specifically also kind of relies on the threat in question not being real, so the AF in this case should make arguments about why China really is a threat. There's also plenty of people willing to defend capitalism as a system. On the cap case specifically, it's important for the AF to win that cap is sustainable. If cap isn't sustainable, then it's try or die for the alt. A hard right AF against a cap case should also read as many impact turns as they can. Cap solves war, climate change, space colonization, structural violence, whatever. Capitalists think that capitalism solves everything, so go ham. Now, if the K is Afro-pessimism or feminism, don't say anti-black racism isn't real or patriarchy isn't real. Just don't. Finally, the AF needs to answer the alternative. This is usually the worst part of the K because large pervasive structural issues don't typically have simple solutions. You want to have an answer to both the theory of power and the specific method they've proposed. The K's theory of power is exactly what it sounds like. How do they think power operates in our society? The security K thinks power is primarily maintained by elites through the us-them mentality. The cap K thinks power is primarily maintained by elites through class oppression. You need to dispute these claims in some way. For these two Ks specifically, this actually gets done more on the impact debate, but that's not the case for all critiques. After that, you want to answer the specific method in the 1 and C. So the alt wants to build the party. You need to give some reason the party sucks. Unflinching paradigmatic analysis? Fails. Feminist analysis of international relations? Wrong. Useless expenditure? Ineffective. Give back the land? Impossible. You get the idea. Now, if you're new to debate and you're just grabbing the squad answers to a particular critique, you may not understand the warrants behind the historical materialism answers you pulled out of a back file. That's okay. Just stay calm, read the card during prep time, and try to understand it as best you can. That covers the broad strokes of what you need in a K2AC. Somewhere in there, you need to have offense. If you plan on mostly going for extinction at ways in the 2AR, your offense is probably going to be on the impact and alt level. If your ideal 2AR is a permutation, then you might want to link turn in addition to offense on the alt. You also want to pepper in as many theory arguments as makes sense. These should be arguments that you can make in 10 seconds, but it takes the block more like 30 seconds to answer. Some common ones would be vague alts, floating picks, and utopian alts. Conditionality also applies to critiques, but that's a whole separate video. Now let's talk about the K in the block. Kicking a K is pretty easy. Just say extend the perm, it's just a test of competition, we're not going for it. If the app has a conditionality argument, you need to answer that. But if they don't, you can just say they've conceded the thesis of conditionality. Extending a K can be a time-intensive affair. You want to start the 2 and C or the 1 and R with an overview a lot like you do with the disad. Your overview should start with an explanation of your theory of power. On security, for example, you want to explain how self-fulfilling prophecies work and some examples that are relevant to the AF.
You can get away with a relatively small theory of power on cap since it's so well understood, and a lot of the theory of power of cap gets debated on the impact level. Some folks want 1NCs to have a separate card explaining the theory of power, but that's more of a stylistic choice. It's also often redundant with your other evidence, but sometimes it needs to be its own card at some point. Once you've explained it, impact your theory out. What's happening because of the way power is wielded? Who is wielding it? Who is being affected by it? What happens to the world if we keep going on like this? Security and cap are both designed to have inroads to extinction to help turn and outweigh the AF, and they each have more proximate impacts as well. In addition to the endless war impact, the security K also has a serial policy failure impact that turns the AF. This is closely tied with epistemology, so we'll look at serial policy failure and epistemology together later when we talk about neg framework. Just know that organizationally, it goes here. For the cap K, this is where arguments about ethics and structural violence typically fall. The common mistake people make with K overviews is that they over-explain. Before you know it, the overview is 6 minutes long and all of your line by line is, "That was in the overview." Not only does this annoy your judges because their flow is so trashed, but it also means that you're just wasting your own time waxing poetic about the philosophy in question instead of actually winning the debate. The overview is not the time to prove how much you know about the theory involved. That is way better demonstrated through specificity in other parts of the debate. After this point, the goal should be mostly to go in the 2AC order. Since basically every 2AC starts with framework and then makes a perm, that makes your life pretty easy. The next framework counterinterp in the block is usually something to the effect of the AF should have to defend the epistemological and ontological assumptions of the 1AC. Sometimes it's more like evaluate the epistemological and ontological assumptions of the 1AC prior to implementation. The first interpretation is just trying to make sure the neg gets links based off of the advantages. The second interpretation is you don't get an AF. The first one is much easier to win, so we'll concern ourselves with that one. First, we need to define some terms. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Epistemology asks us how we know, what we know, if we know it at all. It's all very deep. In debate, epistemology usually just comes down to how well each team understands reality. The theory of power the K presents usually challenges the AF's core knowledge production, or how they think reality works. You think an us-them mindset is good, or capitalism is inevitable because you've been socially conditioned to ignore evidence to the contrary by people who have a vested interest in holding on to that power in the status quo. If we can't trust where the AF gets its knowledge from, how do we know any part of the 1AC is true? This is where serial policy failure comes in on security. Serial policy failure says that because traditional politics are so wrapped up in the security mindset, they will inevitably fail. They can't ever solve problems because traditional politics need problems to exist to justify the awful things that elites do to hold on to power. Traditional politics are designed to be crappy, so whatever the AF does to solve the problem is just going to blow up in their face. Ontology is the study of being. In debate, this generally becomes a criticism of how the 1AC relates to or misunderstands how some other group relates to the world. With cap and security, this doesn't end up going super far. With some other more psychoanalytic-based theories, like certain subsets of anti-blackness and settler colonialism, ontology becomes a claim about the fundamentally irredeemable nature of civil society. Check out those modules for more information on how this works. Now, the reason the neg bothers with this interpretation at all is because the AF's interp may turn out to be less, we get an AF, and more, you don't get a K. Sometimes the AF will morph their framework interp to mean, you only get links off of the one-sentence plan text. The logic here is that counterplans and disadd links are based off of the action the 1AC takes, i.e. the plan text, so the K should be held to the same standard. Except that they're not. Advantage counterplans are a thing, but whatever. Critiques are different from dissadds and counterplans, so holding them to exactly the same standard is pretty arbitrary. Additionally, since Ks are about ethics, the blog should have some examples of some unethical things AFs could get away with if critiques could only garner links off of the plan text. For example, this logic justifies the AF saying some super racist stuff in one of their advantages since the neg can only get links to the plan text. If the plan text isn't racist, then it's fine, even though everything else was. The advantages are also the justifications for doing the affirmative, so evaluating whether or not those justifications are good is probably a good thing. If the AF was literally just an 8-second plan text, they wouldn't have met any of their other basic burdens of proof. Personally, I think everyone's life is a lot easier if the AF just agrees that the neg gets links to the advantages and the neg just agrees that the AF gets an AF. But that's just me. Next, the neg needs to answer the impact framing part of the framework debate. This is where the AF forwarded utilitarianism as the best way to evaluate impacts, and perhaps a card about why consequentialism is good. The consequentialism card is just there to give a reason why we should be less concerned with ontological or epistemological justifications, and more concerned with the actual consequences of the 1AC, solving extinction. The neg should respond with some indites of utilitarianism, and then a reason why either extinction doesn't come first, or the neg accesses the AF's extinction framing. Answers to util vary, but most of them boil down to us not actually caring about everybody equally. The examples here will depend on the K in question, but you always need examples. The security K might talk about the ongoing regular wars and proxy wars the US is carrying out in the Middle East. The Cap K might talk about the everyday violence the global proletariat faces under capitalism. These arguments don't say extinction would be good for marginalized groups, just that util doesn't actually matter until it's the ruling class that's threatened, which makes it a bad ethical model. It also gives the government license to do basically anything. Using the threat of extinction as a justification, the US invaded Iraq, kicking off decades of ongoing conflict that have killed way more people than Saddam Hussein ever did, because he supposedly had weapons of mass destruction. The threat of extinction is not only insincere, but it's a justification for atrocity. After the framework debate usually comes the permutation, which is complicated since the perm has attested the link, and we haven't done the link debate yet. You kind of have two options here. You can either start the link debate first, and just go out of order, or you can answer this specific permutation, throw in a quick all links are disads at the end, and then do the link debate later. It's up to you, really. Judges have preferences, but those preferences are variable and contradictory, so just do what makes the most sense to you. When answering the perm, always say that the perm is either severance or intrinsic, because basically everything but perm do both is. Severance perms sever out of some portion of the 1AC. In a K debate, it's usually the justifications for or the representations in the 1AC. Intrinsic perms are perms that add something that wasn't part of the AF or the alt. This is most common with the good old perm double bind. Perm double bind says perm do the AF and the alt in all other instances. Double bind. Either the alt is strong enough to overcome the residual links to the affirmative, or it isn't strong enough to overcome the status quo. Basically, if the alt is good enough to change all of the instances of, say, capitalism in the status quo, adding the AF to that pile shouldn't make a difference. Except that the other instances weren't part of either the alt or the AF, which makes them intrinsic. This is a debate. The question of the debate is whether or not the judge should vote for the AF, not whether or not billionaires exist. When extending the link in the block, you want to extend the link from the 1NC and develop a couple of new ones. For each link, you should be very specific about what exactly in the 1AC does the bad thing. A lot of times, you should be rereading parts of 1AC or 2AC cards to demonstrate exactly what you're talking about. This is what people mean when they say contextualize the link to the AF. In our security K example, we might end up with a crisis management link, a bargaining link, and a control link. The Cap K might include a growth link, a labor link, and an innovation link. Don't get caught up on the specifics here. The point here is to illustrate that creating good link arguments requires a general knowledge of the philosophy behind the critique, and you want to name all of your link arguments. Naming your links makes them a lot easier to flow, especially if you're doing all of your link work in one spot. It also makes it easier in the 2NR to extend them by saying they drop the crisis management link. Finally, you need to explain the alt. The alt might make an appearance in your overview, but don't do the actual alt work in your overview unless the AF just drops it, which they might. Make sure you've checked your judge's paradigm before the debate to see if they have anything to say about alt thresholds. If anywhere in there they have a complaint that alts in debate never get explained, I'd still recommend setting aside some time to explain the alt outside of your overview. You should also establish the threshold for alt solvency here. What exactly does the alt have to accomplish for the negative to win? This is especially important if there's a utopian fiat argument. Alts don't fiat anything. They just give a hypothetical strategy for dealing with the impacts. The neg's argument should be they just need to demonstrate the strategy would be effective, not that everybody in the world is magically a Marxist. The last thing we need to address real quick is how familiar you need to be with a philosophy to read the corresponding critique. Look, it's impossible to be well read on everything in debate. It's just not feasible. And I think that's okay. I think exposure to ideas can give you a framework for them, even if you didn't read a million books on the topic in question. And this certainly isn't the purview of just critiques. Look at the arms sales topic. I still think most debaters don't know the difference between realism and liberalism, and most explain realism incorrectly. And that wasn't even a big topic. But every AF, counterplant, and most disads on that topic relied on one of those two IR theories. But we don't make sweeping statements about disad debaters not understanding their theories well enough. Obviously, the better you understand the literature behind your argument, the better off you're going to be. But I think the weird gatekeeping around Ks is largely unwarranted. Can bad K debaters give certain philosophies a bad name? Sure, I hated Baudrillard until like grad school. But I also hated politics debaters. Debaters not understanding their arguments is not unique to Ks, and I really wish we would stop pretending it was. Rant over, and this video has gotten longer than I would like it to be, so that'll have to do it for critiques.